to you live from the 6th floor of the Hiawatha here in Portland, Maine. It is the System Failure Podcast.
Yeah, how we doing, Brian?
Oh, I'm pretty good. How are you?
Oh, I'm pretty good indeed. It's nice to be here for episode number 2. All right, well, we call the podcast System Failure, and we call the Substack System Failure, and built into those titles is the assumption that we are witnessing a system that is failing. So I think it only makes sense here in episode number 2 to sort of set the table and to establish the raft of ideas that show that we are, in fact, in a system in decline and failure. We would kind of want to set a historical context, so we're going to talk some history here, and that will really, that historical context really tells us, where we are in the great cycles of history, the great sweep of the human story. So that's our little plan for today.
I don't know. Are you sure that we're in a system that's in decline?
Oh, yes. Now, to be fair, I have predicted collapse every year since 2017. But I think when we start coloring in, some of the historical details that illustrate our position, it'll become pretty clear that we are overdue for a collapse. In fact, the main contention animating the whole system failure constellation of ideas is the idea that the American Empire, when they write the history books, the American Empire will have the date 1776 to 2008, and I think that the end has really already come, and we're in a weird, twilight moment where things are already falling apart, and we're all just kind of carrying on. Adam Curtis calls this hypernormalization. I highly recommend checking out Adam Curtis's many documentaries on YouTube for the BBC. They're free to watch, and they're outstanding. But the idea behind hypernormalization is that Curtis used this to describe the Soviet period after the fall of leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union and Russia. Everyone knew that the system had collapsed, but no one could really articulate that in public. People didn't know what to do with themselves, so they just kind of went about their day-to-day business, knowing that the animus that gets everyone up in the morning and has them go to work and decides what work they'll do, and all of that sort of rationalization was completely gone. It was completely in the toilet. But people just kind of sleptwalked to their jobs anyway because they didn't have an alternative vision for what life could be like, and so they kind of just existed in a weird twilight state. And I think that's exactly where we are here in America in 2023.
We are in an eerie place where no one has belief in what we're doing. And I think obviously a collapse and a start of something new, everyone, especially our age, is desperate for that. We're all looking for that catharsis because we're all spectacularly unsatisfied, or it seems like a lot of people are anyway.
They call them deaths of despair, suicide, overdose deaths, things like that. They're clearly on the rise and becoming a blight on society. Almost every family now has been touched by someone with a suicide or with an overdose or one of these, kind of ugly ends to people's stories. There are some traditions and philosophies that view history as cyclical, that we move through history like you move through the seasons of the year. But I think that most people in the modern era have a different sense. I think the idea that there is a rise to the run of history, the sense that I get, at least being educated in a Western school and Western education system, is that we are on a long journey of where things used to be bad, but they get gradually better over time, versus the cyclical view where things return to the same starting point. The assumption that the story of history as we understand it really revolves around this idea of societies becoming more free over time. I think everyone understands that when the agricultural revolution first went off, the societies that resulted were very top-down societies. There was usually one god king at the top of the society, and everyone else kind of served that god king. They did exactly what he said, and disobeying the king would be grounds for immediate execution. And so everything that everyone did kind of served to glorify the ego of this one person. And of course, the Roman Empire is the quintessential example, the premier example of these top-down slave societies. And of course, the fall of Rome is usually characterized as 410 AD. And of course, after 410 AD, there were people who considered themselves citizens of Rome. But much like we still consider ourselves Americans in the post-2008 era, we're living in a strange, the date that's going to mark the end of our society has already passed, but we just haven't really got the historical perspective to recognize what's happened yet. But yeah, so going back to this idea of the great arc of history, once the Roman Empire collapsed from those glowing embers, we got medieval society. And medieval society was organized not with the relation of production master and slave, but instead the relation of production lord and serf. And there's no question that when you think about how many wagon loads of food would have had to go into a city like Rome every day just to keep the populace fed, there's no question that in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, when they didn't have to ship, the farmers who populated the countryside, the Italian countryside, no longer have to ship all of those crazy amounts of food into the city. The demand for their product has collapsed. They don't need to produce as much agricultural product. And their life got, substantially better. Very generally speaking, in the Middle Ages, a peasant could expect to, in a typical 7-day work week, they could expect to work the land for 3 days on their own behalf and to feed their own families, and to work 3 more days on behalf of their feudal lord, whoever they'd sworn fealty to. And then on Sunday, of course, they would go to church and hear why this is the arrangement that God prefers and why this is the only way to live and the best way to live. And so, being a peasant was very limiting. Your land would pass down from oldest son to oldest son, and if you happen to be a second or third son, you would have to become an itinerant warrior or a knight. There wasn't really any way for you to inherit lands if you weren't the oldest son. It was much better to be a peasant in the Middle Ages than a slave on one of the Roman latifundia. That's for sure. But then what happened to medieval society was the Black Death in the summer of 1349. Over the next couple of years, that disease wiped out half the peasants who were working the lands for these feudal lords. And then the peasants got it in their minds that they could, instead of swearing fealty to one feudal lord, they could play one lord off against the other in a bidding war, right? See who's going to pay them the most for their labor. And of course, the nobility tried to enforce the prior existing medieval class structure at the point of the sword, but it was to no avail. The idea that workers should be free to rent out their labor to the highest bidder took hold, and that's where we get our modern paradigm of employer and employee. And these relations of production, these roles of production, employer and employee, gradually replaced lord and serf, which had gradually replaced the master and slave. So the idea here is I think at least everyone who has been educated in the West kind of has this sense that history is a long inversion from top-down control, like rigid top-down control, to more bottom-up democratic societies. And we say we value society. At least we pay lip service to the notion of democracy as being an important thing in our current society, and that's what makes us think that we exist in a better state now than we have in the past. And certainly for the average employee, material conditions are better than being a serf, and being a serf is better than being a slave, as we mentioned. But the idea is that life gradually improves over time, and that we are gradually making a better and better society. It's kind of like a utopian view of society. I just assume that things will be better, in 1 and 2 or 300 years than they are now, and that things are better now than they were 1 or 2 or 300 years ago. And it does seem like it's hard, especially with the pace of technology, which we'll get more to technology later. The pace of technology really lends this idea to the fact that well-being is increasing or improving over time. And though there may be, drops like in a stock market chart that has a sawtooth pattern to it, overall, very generally speaking, the broad trajectory is an upward trajectory. Would you agree with that assessment?
Pre-9/11 days and back in the 90s, it seemed like we were making progress, and the internet had come out, and the Berlin Wall had came down, and it certainly seemed like Western society, was making progress. And then 9/11 happened, and a dark cloud fell over the land. People obviously see that there's some kind of issue now, and the myth of continual progress of Western society is certainly much harder to believe.
Yeah, 9/11 sure was crazy. That was really used as an excuse to clamp down, to introduce a whole surveillance state, and to really, try to clamp down on regular folks like us, and that's one of the main concerns I have in the aftermath of the January 6th incident from 2021, is that would be an excuse to, obviously the government implemented a whole bunch of surveillance measures on all of us, whether legal or not, in the aftermath of 9/11. But my concern is that they would use the January 6th incident to really solidify those sorts of the sort of legal options that labeling someone a terrorist overseas gives them, that they would now do that to domestic citizens. The rationale would be that January 6th is so egregious that we have to be able to go after domestic terrorists the same way we go after foreign terrorists, and that means like secret FISA courts and secret warrants, and a whole level of having the government's actions shrouded in secrecy. That is like definitely a concern.
Well, the attack of 9/11, the shock and awe of seeing these buildings collapse, and like all, thousands of people die in New York. But the attack of 9/11, it just pales in comparison to the attack on everyone, every citizen of the United States and probably elsewhere, just in the forms of like insane security, taking your shoes off at the airport, the overall like level of like fear, the constantly the threat level like switching from like orange to red or whatever each day. And
that was so comical. What day? Yeah, that's the joke in American Dad. They've got the wheel on the fridge. You can point the arrow to whatever the threat level is that day. It's so absurd.
I mean, if you're concerned about your safety, you got, oh yeah, we got to take this seriously. But well, if you just think about it from a propaganda standpoint and how effective that is, and how that marshaled the political currency needed to carry out these crazy campaigns in the Middle East that looted the coffers of the government to be spent on military weapons to enrich our military contractors. It's truly shocking.
Yeah. The post 2011 Bush era was really. I mean, I thought that was crazy and divisive. And I definitely got suckered into voting for Obama in 2008. His message of hope. I naively thought I came of age during, and I know you did too, during the Iraq and Afghan war era of the Bush administration. And I just really thought if we got some Democrats in there, then all of our problems would be solved, and that everything was. I just totally fell for this propaganda, concept that if we just get the Democrats in there, everything will be all right. I'll never forget reading in the WikiLeaks, Julian Assange's WikiLeaks troves, the emails from between the Obama administration and major banks on Wall Street, Chase Manhattan, and what have you, where they were making sure that all of Obama's cabinet appointees were approved by the bank, and then no one went to jail for the insane amounts of fraud that went on in the lead up to 2008, like maybe one sacrificial goat on Wall Street, but that's it. And the whole system, basically 10 people on Wall Street made billions and hollowed out, to a large extent, the American middle class. And the Obama administration, he really turned out to be the bank's man through and through. It was a stunning bait and switch that I felt hook, line, and sinker for. And I think, in my mind, there's no question that Obama's betrayal of America brought us the Donald in 2016. I mean, that's why no one wanted. That's why people were so reluctant to vote for Hillary, and that's why the Donald who, seemed at least he seemed like an outsider. He seemed like someone the establishment didn't approve of. The RNC and DNC duopoly didn't approve of, and that made people vote for him just out of a sense of just out of the contrarian sense of we hate these people. We can't stay on the side of them. We know they lie to us nonstop. So yeah, I think that the 9/11 to 2008 era set the stage for what we're now going through, the aforementioned period of hypernormalization that we are struggling through at this very moment.
Well, there is this amazing macro cycle where they get all the young people to believe that all we need to do is elect a Democrat and we'll be fine. Well, at least it's happened twice here. Just after George Bush, everyone felt like if we just elected Obama, things would be great. And then once again, young people seem like they're whipped up into a frenzy with a business with the Donald, and that we just need to elect a Democrat. And now we've done that. Well, obviously, it's spending all our money in the war in the Ukraine instead of spending money at home, which certainly seems questionable. Or we're just once again spending money on arms elsewhere rather than investing money into people here. But anyway, you're just getting into the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah. So the reason I put a pin in 2008 and marked that as the end of the American empire is I think what happened in 2008. The thing to understand about balance sheets and this accounting concept of the balance sheet is that the balance sheet is just a list of assets and liabilities. And the thing to understand about whenever you have debt, whenever you have a mortgage to the bank, that mortgage to you is a liability. You have your $2,000 payment every month. So if you had a set of books, you would count the mortgage as a liability, but the bank counts it as an asset. And so the thing to understand is that the much of the fortunes of the rich are future payments they've been promised, versus actual cash in the bank right now. And so the rich, didn't want to take a haircut. The rich had written all of these loans out. Like, the most crazy example is the Wells Fargo banking executives' internal emails. Again, the WikiLeaks. I think it's WikiLeaks that brought us their internal emails, but the Wells Fargo execs were referring to elderly African American women as mud people because you could sign them up for a variable rate mortgage. You could literally go to door with a clipboard and refinance their mortgages to an adjustable rate. And that might save them a few $100s in the near term, but in the long term, they would end up with a ballooning mortgage payment that they couldn't really afford. And so all these loans were written and then counted by the bank as an asset, and then they turned out to be not enough. There just isn't money enough. These elderly African American women just didn't actually have the money to pay these crazy mortgage bills every month. But the rich didn't want to write down. They didn't want to admit that the debt was unpayable. They didn't, in other words, want to write down their balance sheet. So to avoid doing that, they convinced us all to use the Federal Reserve to monetize their debt, or that is to say, to buy the debt at face value, to turn it into real dollars now that they could put into their bank accounts. And that way, their balance sheets would be much more. They would be, they wouldn't be underwater on their balance sheets. They wouldn't have to sell off a bunch of assets, and they could keep paying on the mortgage-backed securities that were derivative off these mortgages. And so the whole, in order to keep the whole system of credit in place, they basically turned what was for them a private debt crisis, where they really needed to write down their balance sheets to reflect the actual ability of the debtors to pay the debt. Instead of doing that, we just hooked it up to the U.S. money printing machine, monetized the debt, and thereby transferred a private debt crisis for them into a sovereign debt crisis for all of us to deal with. And I think that's where we are in this moment.
Well, we sure are in a debt crisis.
If you imagine the bond markets and the stock market is this giant wedding cake with all these layers, the bottom layer, the base of it, is treasuries. The idea is that the U.S. government, since they have the money printer, would never default on the bonds that they sell to investors. That is to say, they'll always be able to print up the dollars and hand them to the investors who hold the treasury bonds. But the question is, how much of those dollars going to be worth? and if the dollars aren't going to be worth very much, then investors will demand a very high interest rate to buy them. They won't be able to, in other words, the treasury auctions, just no one will want to buy that U.S. debt unless it's at a certain level. And so when the analogy of the multi-layer cake is that when a big company, when one of these huge, like Apple wants to borrow money, they have a crazy amount of money in the bank. They'd never borrow money. But when a big corporation, a reputable corporation, wants to borrow money, they don't go to the bank and ask for a loan. They issue bonds on a bond market. But of course, even a big corporation sometimes goes belly up and defaults on their bonds. So if you're an investor, of course, you're going to demand a little bit higher return on investment just because of the increased risk of buying the bonds for these big American companies. And then there's the junk bonds stacked on top of that, where investors are going to demand an even higher rate of return. These are the ones from Wolf of Wall Street, where they would sell these highly risky bonds as if they were sure things, and kind of defraud their investors and use that to just basically print their own money and to have wild parties. That's the whole plot behind the movie. And then stacked on top of that is the stock market, where the prices are really volatile and there's no guarantee of return at all. And investors, demand a proportionally higher return on their investment if they're going to invest in your stock. Your stock's going to have to perform against the bond market. Otherwise, investors would just go to the bond market and invest their money on a more sure thing. So the sovereign debt crisis has the ability to bring down the entire economy. But in the meantime, we're in a crazy position now where there's just madness going on at the Treasury Department. We're just racking up crazy bills. I think that most of the big banks and most of the people in government understand that the debts we're racking up can never really be paid. So they're just extracting as much as they can in this wild twilight period of hypernormalization. And the banks don't want anyone elected to office who's going to talk about what's going on down at Treasury. They don't want anyone to acknowledge the existence of the banking scam. And we're still these private equity funds and Wall Street funds and all of the money that's in the banking system. It buys up things. We have like what's called a free market, so they can freely buy up our media, our newspapers, and our TV channels, just like Jeff Bezos did with the Washington Post, and make sure that no one's mentioning the crazy thing that's going on over the Treasury Department. You have to be willing to keep that quiet in order to be elected, and I think that's why having the Donald, who is he's like a platonic ideal of the loose cannon, having him be able to effortlessly win the nomination was a real concern for them, and why we had all of the intelligence agencies come out of the woodwork to declare, that the Don's election was really thanks to Moscow and not at all thanks to our own misdeeds during the Obama administration and during the 2008 financial crisis.
Well, it's just a bummer that the Donald couldn't do more to change the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, he always was a carnival barker, but I understand why it would feel good to pull the lever for the Donald. Do you remember that that video that Michael Moore produced in the leading up to 2016, saying the Donald's likely to get elected because people are having fun pulling that lever to put up their middle finger to the people who have obviously mismanaged our economy and who are supposed to be representatives of people in Washington, but in fact are representatives of the bank, who, as I said, will keep a hush-hush going on the impending collapse we're all going to have to face. So yeah, it really is it's a crazy, we really live in wild times, and you won't really see that acknowledged in the papers or in the media, because as I say, they're billionaire owned, they're hedge fund owned. And so I mean, we talked about this in the first episode, the fact that no one's acknowledging the fact that there's a whole generation of people that can never afford houses is something that you just don't see reflected in the movies, and you don't see it reflected in the newspapers, and you don't see it reflected on the news. And so you just end up feeling crazy and isolated. I think that is something that a lot of people can relate to in this day and age. Before we get off the topic of the gradual, I like to compare it to an iceberg roll in the ocean. We've all probably seen videos online where an iceberg is floating in the ocean, and the ocean water melts it and the sun melts it in such a way that it changes its equilibrium, and it rolls. It rotates 180 degrees, so that what was once the bottom of the iceberg is now facing up, and the top of the iceberg is now underwater. And that sort of inversion from top-down control to bottom-up control, characterizing the march of history as we understand it from the agricultural revolution till now. So the other thing to consider there is that in all times, there's a weird contradiction, because in all times and places, the powers that be want to assure us that we are on an upward sort of utopian trajectory, but at the same time, they want to assure us that there is no better way to live than the way we're living right now. This is the best, that capitalism, for example, is the best system ever, or the medieval system is the best system ever. So it's interesting that we simultaneously have this utopian vision for the arc of humanity, but at the same time, and people believe this meme that gets put out there that no, this is the best system. There is no better option than this, and we'll never move forward, or we never should move forward. But really, when you think about it, that's ridiculous. Any system arises under certain circumstances, and obviously is going to be well suited to those circumstances. But if circumstances always change, I think that's the great lesson of Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher. That's the guy that said you never step in the same river twice. The idea that everything flows and nothing remains the same. We shouldn't be surprised that systems have a life cycle to them, that they start out really effective, but then lose effectiveness over time. That's the pattern we saw with the Roman Empire, with its master-slave relationship. It's what we saw with the medieval period, with its lord and serf relationship. And it's what we should expect to see for our employer-employee, modern economy of capitalism that brought us through the Industrial Revolution until now. And I do want to note some of the interesting similarities or the interesting reflection between some of the things that happened at the end of the medieval period and some of the things now. Now we've already talked about the Black Death killing all those people in Europe, but there's also an element of the Black Death where, in addition to changing the economics, it really undermined the credibility of the authorities. Why? Because back then they didn't have a germ theory of disease. The church, the representation of the church was just considered to be the truth, and no one questioned it. It was just in the background of their lives as their unquestioned assumptions. And the church was dealing with, instead of a germ theory of the disease, they had a wrath of God theory of disease, that God would strike down people who were sinful or people who God didn't approve of. But uncomfortably for the church, the priests were dying at the same rate as everyone else, right? It seemed like the horror fell upon the clergy just as much as everyone else. It became really clear that the church had no idea what was going on, and it really undermined their authority when they were, no matter how many prayers they said, they couldn't bring an end to the plague, because of course it was caused by rats and spread that way. So it's interesting that we have a COVID-19 epidemic now that, as we said in the last episode, no matter which side of the political divide you fall on, I mean, there is no question that our institutions emerged from COVID-19 badly damaged. A lot of people who believed in, who did not question the competence or authority of our institutions definitely are now doing so when they wouldn't have before. So that aspect of even though the death toll from the Black Death didn't match the relatively light death toll from COVID-19, it still had this effect of badly undermining the authorities, which is fascinating to notice. And then another example is revolution in communication technology. Like in the aftermath of the Black Death, the printing press was invented, and the printing press, of course, led directly to the Protestant Reformation that just shattered the existing power structure of medieval Europe. I mean, people could print up pamphlets faster than the church could ban them or track them down, and censor them. And they printed up. They didn't. Not only did they print up pamphlets complaining about the church's shameless money scheme of making people pay for remission of sin, and not only did people report on the ridiculous, conspicuous wealth that the church was engendered, in direct violation of some of the teachings in the Bible. They also printed up versions of the Bible in the Vulgate, or languages people could understand, and circulated those. And boy, was that explosive when people cracked those pages and found that Christianity was, in fact, a hyper-communistic cult, with Jesus reacting wrathfully to moneylenders and physically assaulting them and throwing them out of the Temple of Solomon, for example, or saying that it's a camel would sooner pass through the eye of a pin or a needle than a rich man will enter into the kingdom of heaven. There is no, when you crack the Bible, there really is no question that this is a pro-poor, anti-rich tradition. And I think Will Durant says that the way he puts it is that when people crack the Bible written in a language they can understand, they suddenly realize the compromises that the church had made with human nature. It's a nice way to say that they didn't report on the things in the Bible that made them look not so good for hoarding all of this wealth. The internet is mirroring that today. I mean, there is no people, like, for example, the whole Black Lives Matter thing, that with the advent of the internet, people are able to exchange videos of police brutality, which might have just gone unreported in the past, and they're able to compare notes and gain a line of sight that the authorities don't have control over, and be able to exchange information and kind of nudge each other and say, "You seeing what I'm seeing?" I think the internet has been, in other words, a major player in the disruption of people's faith in authorities, just like it was during the late Middle Ages.
Well, the internet certainly promised to be that for a bit there. The internet seems like it's falling in line. Well, it's mixed. But I mean, a lot of the internet stinks. Yeah,
you can see them struggling to get control over it. Just like the Catholic Church struggled to get control over the books that were being printed up. But on the other hand, here we are, spitting this into a microphone and distributing it over the internet. The censors haven't gotten to us, at least not yet. Before we move on to discussing technology, there's one other big thing that happened during the end of the medieval period that I think we are going to see in the near future here. And that is the reality inversion that comes with the realization that the sun is not in orbit around the Earth. The opposite is true. We are moving around the sun. And up until Kepler and Copernicus published their findings, any fool could see the sun moving across the sky, right? But that's an optical illusion. What's really happening is we are in orbit around the sun. And that realization also destroyed the credibility of the powers that be. The church, of course, stuck to the old Ptolemaic geocentric model of the solar system, even in the face of Galileo printing his famous work, and obviously arresting Galileo and confining him to his house in response to him spreading what they determined to be heretical ideas. But it's very interesting to me that there's a reality inversion that characterizes the transition from the late medieval period to the Renaissance. And I think we have a similar reality inversion waiting in store for us. And this goes back to the tradition of magic, or the psychedelic tradition, or the tradition of Eleusis in Greece. And that's this idea that reality is like a lucid dream, like you're simultaneously creating it and experiencing it all at once. And I think that there are two really powerful pieces of evidence that point to this being the case, that the scientific community, which assumes that there is such thing as an objective observer, has to just sail right past these assumptions, even to just set up their shop. And those two pieces of evidence are, of course, the double slit experiment, which which shows that it's a really complicated explanation. You can go on Substack and go into the main thesis and see an animated GIF that helps explain it. But the punchline is basically that if you have a metal plate that you're shooting electrons through, and you put two slits in those plates, that you get a totally different pattern on a electromagnetic sensitive screen beyond the plate, depending on if you measure which slit an electron's going through. So you have to picture like a shooting range, an electron gun at the one end of the shooting range, and a target at the other, and a metal plate in between with two slits on it. And the like I say, the punchline is that when you are shooting this electron gun randomly and not measuring which slit it goes through, you get one pattern on the wall beyond, on the target beyond. And when you measure which slit the electrons are going through, it totally changes the pattern. A good way to understand this is an email. If I type up an email, you could write a probability equation for all the people that might receive an email when I open up a new email in Gmail. Like the people who I know, like for example you, Brian, the odds are pretty good. You could assign a high probability that I would send an email to you just because I have in the past, or to people I know, and then there's people whose email address I'm not aware of whatsoever, and we could assign a probability of near zero that my email would go to that person. But the point is that if you wanted to write a mathematical equation for where my email is going to go, you could write it in probabilistic terms. There's a 60% chance I'll send it to Brian, a 20% chance I'll send it to my mom, another 20% chance I'll send it to my dad, for example. And the idea is that equation changes once I hit send on the email. The range of possible people I could send the email to collapses down into a single reality when I push the send button. And in this comparison, hitting the send button is analogous to measuring which slit the electron goes through. And of course, the other example that everyone knows about is the placebo effect, which is just bizarrely powerful. The effect is so powerful that pharmaceutical drug makers have to factor this into their clinical trials in order to be even remotely effective at having those clinical trials. And the idea is that if you're given a sugar pill, it will often have the healing effect. If you believe that sugar pill is real medicine, it will often have the same medicinal effects as the medicine. There's also the nocebo effect, where even if they tell you you're getting the sugar pill, you'll still experience some healing effects from it, which is just really blows the mind. So both the double slit experiment and the placebo effect tell us that the reality that we experience that seems so concrete is really at least partially of our own generation or creation, and it's not just a observer experiencing something objectively. That there's a weird synergy going on here, and I think that coming to terms with that reality could be the reality inversion that's analogous to the reality inversion that ended the Middle Ages of the sun and the earth rotating around each other. The sun rotating around the earth rotating around the sun versus the sun rotating around the earth. So I think my prediction is not only that 2008 will mark the end of the American Empire, but that the coming collapse of institutions is going to create a whole new way of understanding the reality that we're moving through. So that's my hot little prediction for the future.
The double slit experiment and the placebo effect certainly suggest what we all seem to have this intuition of. But I mean, yeah, it seems like you're contributing to your experience. Like if you're in a bad mood, it's like hard to make anything good happen. In like poker, there's this idea of tilt, which basically means you're losing your mind because of the way the cards have been dealt.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah, and if you're on tilt, it's pretty much impossible to win. I mean, I guess that doesn't show objective reality, but, it does seem like we are all contributing to the world going on around us. And so it's interesting. Well, there's just a lot of hopelessness and despair, and people are out of their minds, and I think that probably does contribute. The overall nature of the fabric of realities probably is being affected by the way that everyone is lost in despair. And so it's important to do the things that make you, that aren't gonna put you on into despair. And so I don't know, we were talking about the poisons of social media in our first podcast. And I've known for a long time that doom scrolling on Twitter or whatever is going to be bad, but I just keep doing it anyway. But I think you have to make the association in your head that this is poison. And so if you drink a lot, you're gonna feel terrible, and you have to make the same association. And so, sometimes it's okay to like drink a little bit, but you got to realize what you're doing, like when you're going on this social media, that you are poisoning yourself, and take it seriously. And so I mean, I have been thinking about that a lot since the last podcast that we did.
Yeah, and that's another reason why we always want to try to make system failure to be constructive or positive or hopeful versus just, we don't want it to be more doom scrolling, listening to the system failure podcast or reading the system failure Substack. We always want to try to have a message of sort of hope or positivity. So hopefully by the end of this podcast, we can bring it around and not contribute to people's doom scrolling.
All right. Well, hopefully by the end of the run of the podcast, we'll all, evolve into, higher spiritual beings and, be reborn as star children.
It'd be nice. Is it such a big ask? So we've kind of talked about the broader arc of history, and hopefully, we should be convinced that, like its predecessors, the lord and serf system of production and distribution and the master-slave system of production and distribution, we should expect that the employer-employee system of production and distribution will someday, the sun will someday set on it. In other words, that these organization schemes have a life cycle to them, a birth and a death. They come and go over time. So we should expect that employer-employee would just be yet another in a long string of transitional forms. So hopefully, we've at least got the reader convinced at this point that the end of the employer-employee paradigm has to come at some point. But it's just a question of, is it coming soon? And to illustrate that point, you can point to some of the strange similarities between our current age and the end of the medieval period, but that could all be argued to be a coincidence. So we're going to talk some actual specifics in the next section where we discuss technology. And I think technology mirrors the spread of democracy. That is to say, the stock chart that's gradually going up over time, even if there's a lot of fall-offs and a lot of drops in the short term. There's no question that the level of technological sophistication seems to be going up over time, and that previous levels of technological sophistication become calcified into platforms on which new levels of technological sophistication are possible. And so you end up with a similar idea, with a similar chart to the outbreak of democracy or the transition from top-down systems of control to bottom-up systems of control. And the career of technology as it relates to the human story really was the domain of Karl Marx, and so was democracy. And I think talking about Marx is important, not to treat him as some kind of infallible prophet, but just because he has a critique of the current system we're living in, rather than just being a shameless cheerleader of it. I mean, that alone gives his insights value. And furthermore, I think that our parents' generation, the aforementioned baby boomers, were told never to crack a book. It's treated as a heresy, just like the books of magic were during the Middle Ages. You must never read this dark book because just reading it can affect you. You don't even want to crack it and consider what's in there. I always have Professor Richard Wolff, who's one of my favorite YouTubers. His words always ring in my mind. He reports having gone to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford to get his undergraduate, master's, and doctorate in economics, and never once being required to read a word of Karl Marx. That is a bizarre, given the impact of Marx's ideas on the history of huge countries like Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba. That is just a bizarre set of circumstances, and it really tells you a lot about the class structure in the United States. And I think that probably is that probably is the only reason that the counterculture revolution of the late 60s and 70s failed, because, and this is Daniel Quinn's words from that book Ishmael, they weren't able to identify the bars of the cage they were in. They could see they were in a cage, but without the sort of class analysis that comes with a Marxian or Marxist view of history, they couldn't really rebel against the system because they couldn't define it. They just didn't have that muscle, because when they were told that reading Marx is like reading, is like going to the Black Mass or worshiping Satan, they believed it and never cracked that book. So we're going to take Marxian ideas a little more seriously than that. Again, not as if he's some kind of infallible prophet, but just because it will help color our understanding of the current system. And the basics of Marx's philosophy was this, his prophecy of doom almost was this, that the mechanism by which the system of production, where we wear the hat of employer and employee, is doomed because of the technology that it incentivizes. And you have factory owners. In Marx's day, you had in London huge factories that were producing textiles in a lot of cases. And the more inventions like the spinning jenny or the power loom you could introduce to those factories, the more workers you could dismiss, and the more profit there would be for the owner of the factory. Obviously, paying other workers to come every day to the factory gets expensive, and so the more payroll you can save on, the better, the more profitable you can be, and the more money you can take home for yourself. And his insight was simple, like, oh, I see. The more technology is created, the less relevance workers will have to the production process, and the less they'll be able to bargain with their employers when it came time to negotiate wages. Like if people are desperate and starving, they'll accept a much lower wage than they would if they had plenty of money. And so the more workers can be laid off and be in a dire situation, the lower the prevailing conditions on the labor market will be. And that leads me to just a small sidebar. A lot of times people say that, you know, the beauty of the capitalist system is that you're free to leave your job. And they're right. That's exactly what that's exactly the shift we went through after the Black Death knocked out half the peasants of Europe. But there is such thing as prevailing conditions on the labor market. If you own a business and I open a business across the street that pays $100K a year to all the employees, well, that means that your business is going to have to pay $100K a year or lose your employees to this other business. So the whole labor market can be considered, you know, it should be considered regional, but it's connected. So it's not like you can just leave one employer and go to another. They're paying the cost of labor relative to the broader conditions in the labor market. If you are a business that builds houses, you have to buy lumber at whatever price lumber costs on the market, and obviously the more advantageous the lumber market, the more profitable your house building business can become. And labor is bought the same way. It's bought on a market. You just have to pay the prevailing price for labor. The wages that the factory owner has to pay to the worker are totally untethered from their value as a worker, or how much value they produce, or how much experience they have. It's completely determined by what the prevailing conditions on the labor market are. And so the punchline here for Marx's prophecy of doom was that the more, the less money, the technology enables business owners to pay less money to their employees, and that as that situation unwinds, you know, ironically, the market that the business owner sells his products on is the buyers in that market are entirely comprised of employees at the next factory over, right? So what's really happening is that collectively, by laying off workers and replacing them with technology, all these capitalist business owners are actually eradicating the markets for each other's product. Or said another way, you could imagine the great mass of people producing a bunch of products and providing a bunch of services, and then that same great mass of people also consumes those same products and services in a big feedback loop. And that when businesses are first getting off the ground, when you're talking about, you know, a dozen employees, the business owner is going to be the one who organizes that business and is going to be critical. They're going to be, in other words, wearing different hats at the job site. Sometimes they'll be wearing the ownership hat, and sometimes they'll be rolling up their sleeves and working with their employees. But as businesses graduate in size from small business to massive multinational traded on the stock exchange, you eventually get an ownership structure where the owners never show up to the factory at all. I like the example of the Ford family owning all those shares of Ford stock and sending their proxies to the board of directors meetings. And then their only job really is to shuffle down the end of their driveway with their slippers and their bathrobe on and to collect that check from the mailbox every month. And that's really their whole experience of the production process. So of course to them, the only thing worth considering is profit, that they're going to pay their proxies to go to the board of directors meetings and to vote to install CEOs who will only maximize profit without any other consideration at all. And so and of course, part of the CEO's job is to deploy technology to replace workers whenever and wherever they can, whenever it makes financial sense. And so when you get to a point where so many workers are laid off that the Ford company can't sell cars to people, that's when the system is scheduled for collapse, according to Herr Marx. And this whole thing relates to finance when in this country we stop being able to afford the the output of our own production sometime in the 70s, and that's when the credit cards had to come out. Now, from the New Deal to the 1970s, we had massive tax rates on the rich. The top tax brackets were like 95%. These are all, of course, like as I mentioned, New Deal legacy legislation. But since the 70s, we've had a string of politicians who were bought and paid for by the wealthy who slowly whittled down that tax burden and shifted it on to the rest of us, to where we have rich people paying almost nothing in taxes, keeping all of their wealth offshore, taking loans against that wealth and funding their lavish lifestyles that way, but never touching the money itself. And so they never initiate a taxable event on their tax return, and so they can just go forever without paying any taxes on these monies. And you end up in a situation with like a corporation like Bank of America. At the end, they've had years where they had a negative tax liability, which is to say we all collectively cut them a check to exist because they owed negative, because they had so many tax breaks that they were in negative territory and were owed a massive tax refund, which is just bizarre. And so in order to keep the basic functions of society running, we've had to borrow money from the wealthy instead of taxing it from them. And that's what's caused this massive buildup of debt. And now in the post-2008 era, we have every single category of debt is at record levels, be that, credit card debt or auto loans or student loans or mortgage debt. It's really a bizarre situation. But all that, obviously, borrowing money from the wealthy instead of taxing it from them so that we can continue to consume the products we've always consumed with these guys, at the level of the international business that's traded on a stock exchange, the owners really, you could almost think of them as middlemen just charging a toll on this traffic of commerce going from people producing goods and services to consuming them. And so that explains the massive debt bubble that built up prior to 2008. And so much of the balance sheets of the wealthy is, expected future money, and they don't want people to get in their heads that we can just cancel these debts. And that's really a whole nother story we like to get into on system failure. The old traditions of debt forgiveness that kept ancient society stable. Obviously, we haven't got that any more than we have got the Marxian tradition of analysis. But I do think that understanding Marx's fundamental prophecy of doom is key to understanding what we're going through right now, how we're living as a society, and the things that are happening.
Well, certainly with the advent of AI, you can really see it coming to fruition. We're really reaching its logical conclusion where owners are going to be sitting around doing nothing, and AI is going to be doing everything, and the proletariat is going to have nothing. Yeah.
Well, we won't be able to afford the goods and services that the AI is producing because we'll all be unemployed is like I think the fundamental message of Marx. And some of that analysis really makes sense. It would be nice if we could see that sort of analysis on the news or have that kind of self-awareness. But of course, we don't want in this period where basically everything is just being kind of stolen from us, and the numbers are out of control at the Treasury Department. It's just so odd and eerie that no one wants to talk about the obvious elephant in the room, or no one in power, no one in a position of influence does. It's left to podcasts like these and independent and alternative media to talk about it.
Well, really, I think it's even worse. What'll happen is that everyone's going to be paid a degrading wage, and we'll be bombarded with propaganda and distractions that keep us in a ultra enslaved state, and we'll just live in a collective state of misery under our crazy AI capitalist regime.
Yeah, well, that's what they would like to happen, but I don't think it can happen. And we mentioned earlier that we'd like system failure to be optimistic, give people a reason for hope. So let me paint an alternative picture. Everyone knows maybe everyone doesn't know, but imagine all of the mortgage contracts that we have that go higher and higher with each passing year since the 1970s, when the banks have kept adding zeros to everyone's mortgage contracts, and essentially, as you say, enslaved 3 generations now, and we've gotten to the point where a whole generation isn't going to be able to afford houses, and no one in the media no politicians, with the possible exception of Bernie Sanders, are tackling this. But if you imagine that the systems of credit collapse, right? Because it really is the banks, the credit apparatus that is deforming and warping the price of housing on the open market. Like the price of the houses are all worth what the banks can loan against them. So just imagine that the systems of credit collapse, which I think they have to. I think the math suggests they must. When the systems of credit collapse and people can't get a loan to buy a house, you would only be able to buy housing in this thought experiment with the money you have in the bank. And how much money people have in the bank? 20 or 30K, maybe some people have 50K. And so what I'm saying is, if there was no apparatus of credit to loan people money, that would be what houses are going for, right? Houses would go for 30 or 40 or 50K. Trace and I recently got back from a trip to Serbia, and that indeed seems to be what the prices of housing are in Serbia, right? They reflect the use value and not this credit inflated exchange value that houses trade on the market for here. But so what I'm saying is that for the generation who feels locked out of homeownership, all we have to do is wait for the systems of credit to collapse. Now that's going to make things difficult. The money, the intermediary, the medium of exchange that we all use to store up our labor so we can go to the supermarket and get food will be disrupted, and that will be disconcerting. You would see breadlines like you did in the Great Depression. But on the other hand, housing would suddenly become massively affordable for a whole new generation. And unfortunately, for those who already own houses, if there was a collapse in the institutions that give out credit, all those people who have massive mortgages would find themselves tremendously underwater. And I guess, what would you do then? Mail your keys back to the bank? I don't know. We'd all have to buy back our houses from the bank auctions at cut rate prices. But however it shook out, a collapse in the apparatus of credit, like the one we prevented with our 2008 measures of monetizing all these bad debts, would really be a beacon of hope for a younger generation looking to get into housing and start families. So I feel like I always like to reference T-Mac, but he would always say that in times of revolution, the cafes are open all night and there's music in the streets. So I think we should we should all be, us regular folks should see a silver lining in some of the collapse of the institutions that are just no longer serving us at all. We shouldn't regret seeing their demise. So how's that for a somewhat positive spin on events?
Well, if your own life, if you're having strife, having a breakdown, and then rebooting is like how you move on from things.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, obviously having some kind of breakdown and moving on is what the system needs. I think, well, for positive change to happen, I mean, well, we all need to try to create positive change in our own lives and be like our maximal selves, which is probably a lot of work. But in whatever your situation is, I mean, I think that's what you have to work towards.
Yeah, amen, brother. I agree with all of that. And we should be, being strong individually will allow us to be strong as a community. The more powerful or more capable you are as an individual, the more you can help out your neighbor. And that structure of community, I think, is the only way to get through a period where we have to kind of shake the Etch-a-Sketch and restart our system of our economic systems. And the only way that we can allow the sort of exchange of ideas that's necessary for a new system to replace this one. And I definitely think that a return to those kind of ideas of selflessness or of community are going to be an important ingredient to getting us through what are obviously going to be rough times ahead.
All right, well, on that note, I think that's enough for this week.
Well, we'll be back next week with another edition of the System Failure Podcast. Thank you for tuning in.